my main experiences of supporting people to change have led me to believe that we cannot ever make someone change.
Yeah.
That the change process belongs to the person who's either undertaking it or resisting it. And that if we ever transgress and take on that change process for ourselves, then we're getting in the way of the person who's trying to change. I think that's probably one of my most powerful learnings, that if ever I forget that this change process is not mine, if ever I get too invested, and start patting myself on the back of, hey, look how much I've helped this person change. Woohoo, aren't I great? If I ever lean that way or lean the other way and let go of hope for the person, then I am not helping. In fact, the opposite.
So I'm absolutely delighted on the third episode of my Change Talk podcast and to welcome my very long-standing associate and friend, Lydia Guthrie. Hi, Lydia.
Hi, Imogen. It's lovely to have an excellent excuse to talk to you today.
Yeah, absolutely. Really nice to carve out some time just to kind of reflect with you on change and what you've learnt about it. But first of all, do you just want to give people a bit of a kind of potted history of your kind of work life, just so people know where you're coming from?
Yeah, sure. Well, I'll start with how we met, if that's
Oh,
okay.
yeah. Yeah.
So, as Imogen knows, we both met at university. We both did the same degree at the same time in the same year, and in fact did huge amounts of our tutorials together.
We did.
We
We were
carried each other
probably have
across the
half a
learning.
degree each.
Yeah, that's right. And then shortly after my degree, I worked for a charity for a couple of years that I'd volunteered for as a student. And through that experience, I decided I wanted to train as a social worker. Um, I had a very powerful experience of social injustice side by side, I suppose. I have a really strong recollection of spending time as a student. As you know, Imogen, I did PPE at Oxford,
Yeah.
as did you,
Yeah.
and I remember spending some time with the charity I was volunteering for, visiting young people living on some of the estates around Oxford. And I have a really vivid memory of getting off the bus on High Street one day, having spent half a day with a couple of teenage girls who were pretty much raising themselves. They were very neglected, living in poverty, um, and struggling with their health and lots of things that they had no control over. And I got off the bus on High Street and walked through this crowd of about 20 students on their way to a formal dinner, all dressed in black tie. And I just thought how terrible it was. I remember feeling rage at the fact that these two groups of people would be very unlikely ever to meet each other, and yet they lived a mile and a half apart. And it just, I remember getting back to my room and crying at the wrongness of the world. And I think that's kind of what led me down a path of social work. I then went into the probation service straight from a social work course, and learned such a lot. I was a probation officer, I don't know, for about 12 years. I specialised in running the sex offender treatment program. So for about 8 years of that, I had a specialist role working with sex offenders. I ran most offending behaviour groups. I also did a lot of work with people who were perpetrators of domestic abuse, and lots of work in the prison system as well, with life sentence prisoners in particular. I suppose I spent a lot of time thinking about change in that role, as in particular. I then spent about 10 years as a self-employed trainer and writer. I studied attachment theory in a very extensive way in that period of time. I got very curious about how people come to understand their lives and their relationships, their identity, their narratives, their stories. And I then realized how much I was missing working with people. So I trained as a systemic psychotherapist, which is the posh name for a family therapist.
Mhm.
So I'm a psychotherapist qualified to work with groups, uh, sometimes families, sometimes other groups,
Mhm.
and also one-to-one work, but I more commonly work with at least couples. Um, and I've spent some time working in the NHS in children and adolescent mental health services, so CAMS, as that's often known. I now work in children's services for a local authority. So broadly speaking, I offer family therapy to families who have social workers,
Yeah.
because of worries about their children's well-being. So I've kind of gone full circle in a way.
Yeah, yeah, really, really interesting. I mean, it's just I mean, obviously, as you mentioned, we've known each other for years and worked with each other on and off throughout that kind of process. But just to hear that huge range of experience that you've had, yeah,
Yeah.
just really, really, really glad to have this opportunity to reflect with you because obviously this podcast is ultimately trying to kind of unpick change and what
Yeah.
happens, what change looks like, how change happens at kind of individual, family, community, system levels, really. And it just struck me that'd be really interesting to reflect with you on what you've learned about change, really, because it has been a kind of thread running through all of your career.
Yeah.
And I just wondered, I mean, it's a huge question, but take it whichever way you want. What have you learned about how to support people to change most impactfully?
Yeah, it's a great question. I, I think, I think for me, my main experiences of supporting people to change have led me to believe that we cannot ever make someone change.
Yeah.
Um, that that the change process belongs to the person who's either undertaking it or resisting it.
Mm.
And that if we ever transgress and take on that change process for ourselves,
Mm.
then we're getting in the way of the person who's trying to change.
Mm.
I think that's probably one of my most powerful learnings, that if ever I forget that this change process is not mine,
Yeah.
if ever I get too invested,
Mm.
and start patting myself on the back of, hey, look how much I've helped this person change. Woohoo, aren't I great? If I ever lean that way
Mm.
or lean the other way and let go of hope for the person,
Mm.
then I am not helping.
Yeah.
In fact, the opposite.
Yeah.
So for me, as somebody whose role it is to encourage and support change, I think the main thing I do is check my position.
Mm.
Um, am I respecting the autonomy
Mm.
of the person who's making the change process?
Mm.
Um, am I clear on my role? Am I managing the distance between me and them well enough?
Mm.
Am I getting too close or too far away?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think those are some of my main reflections about,
It's about not getting in the way, really, isn't it?
yeah, yeah,
Anyways, yeah,
yeah,
which is really interesting, isn't it? It's kind of, I mean, obviously, it's a hugely nuanced piece to create the right conditions for somebody to change, but
right.
it's really interesting that actually, yeah, one of the massive pitfalls is almost trying too hard to
Yeah,
change somebody.
very much. If I ever rate my success, whatever that is,
Mm.
as a psychotherapist by whether the person changes, if then I stop being useful to the person.
That's really interesting.
The way I need to reflect and rate my own contribution. Not that I do, I don't have a tally sheet. It sounds a bit like I do, like, but if when I'm reflecting and in supervision, that kind of thing, um, it's did I do the best I could to support this person to change, to help? Is the decision they made a thought through decision?
Yeah. Yeah.
If they decide to slam the door in my face and tell me not to come anymore,
Mm.
that's okay. Maybe that's just maybe that's the most they can do right now.
Mm.
In which case, my job is not to do anything which makes it harder for them to come back when
Yeah.
the conditions are different.
Mm.
Um, and if a person does change, then not to take, then to reflect on. with realism about what I might have done to support that.
Yeah.
But never to see it as my success, not ever.
Mm,
Um,
mm,
it's yeah, I ask myself questions of, you know, how hard did I try? You know,
mm,
how much did I prepare? How much hope was I holding for this person? How well did I listen to them? How good were the questions I asked them? You
mm,
know, those are the things that I need to focus on,
mm.
not on whether the person changes or not,
Yeah, that's
because
incredible.
that's up to them.
Yeah, absolutely. It's really, really interesting as in my head as an evaluator on, because of course in this kind of new managerial kind of
Mm.
outcome driven way of, looking at the world, we do often sort of, evaluate services based on whether or not somebody has cut down their drug use, whether somebody's,
Yes.
a family has come off the child protection register, whatever the kind of the outcome we're trying to as a service achieve. So
Mm.
it's really interesting, isn't it, to kind of think about the tensions there, that actually that does, if you look at those outcomes, it actually can get in the way of the very change that you're trying to bring about.
Yeah, that's such a thoughtful point, Imogen. And I guess I'm also thinking that evaluating outcomes is really important.
Mm,
Um, and I suppose for me, part of why I have that approach is because I've worked in very messy environments, in inverted commas. I've worked in environments where you can't screen your clients or certainly in probation, all the work was statutory and mandatory by
mm,
virtue of the fact that someone had broken the law. People weren't asking for help.
mm.
The same in the child protection system. Very often people aren't asking for help. Um,
Absolutely. Yeah.
so I think there might be a different kind of work offered in a different kind of service where it would be more reasonable
Mm,
to, to evaluate that work based on whether people cut down a particular behavior or whether their mood scores on some kind of psychometric measure improved.
mm,
It's I'm not, certainly not saying that that's never relevant.
mm,
Um, but I think in the kinds of environments where I've worked,
mm.
I think it's perhaps less relevant.
Yeah.
I'm
Yeah.
much more focused on, if a person isn't yet ready to change,
Mm.
have I supported them to feel able to come back around next time
Yeah.
when maybe the conditions are different?
Yeah. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
that for me would be a personal metric, I guess.
Yeah, no, that's really, really, really important. And of course, I guess it kind of brings us on to that point about motivation. I mean, you and I have
Yeah.
spent many years working together, running train. Well, you've primarily run the training. I've just come along and
Ah, teamwork, teamwork.
bit of teamwork. But we've run a lot of training around motivational
Yeah.
interviewing, of
Yeah.
course. And I guess, I'm really interested. Obviously, at the start of your career, you were working, as you mentioned, with, some groups that are seen often as quite
Yeah.
challenging,
Yeah.
perpetrators of domestic abuse, perpetrators of sexual offences. And I'm imagining that some of those people
Mm.
didn't perhaps weren't aware that they needed to change, hadn't accepted that
Yeah.
they needed to change, didn't feel that they could change, people who
Yes.
were potentially quite resistant to change. What did you kind of learn about what works with that group of people? How have you kind of
Yeah.
approached that group?
What a fascinating question. Um, I I worked with many people who would deny their offending. So they some of them would outright say, I didn't do this thing of which I've been convicted. I
Mm,
was set up. And
mm,
they would often have quite elaborate stories as to why they were in the position they were in.
mm,
Or, I know I pleaded guilty, but I only did it because my solicitor told me to. And
mm.
I've made a complaint about my solicitor. I was badly advised.
Yeah.
Um, and I think my starting point was often to try to develop a hypothesis about what was underpinning this denial or
Mm,
resistance.
mm,
In in many cases, I came to have the belief that it was shame. It
right.
was
Yeah.
that was getting in the way. It was, how can I go on with my life if I acknowledge that I did this thing, this terrible, terrible thing?
Yeah.
How can I reconcile that with having a life that I feel is worth living?
Mm.
Um, and for many people that was the case.
Yeah.
Um, for others, much more disturbing,
Mm.
the reason they denied their offences was because they didn't think there was anything wrong with them,
Yeah.
and wanted to try to reduce, the amount of time they had to spend talking to people like me, wait until they were in a position to commit the same terrible actions again.
Yeah.
They were much rarer,
Mm.
thankfully.
Mm.
Um, and I think my role with these, and there were some people in the middle.
Yeah.
They're kind of two extremes.
Continue.
And my role with them was very different.
Mm.
People who were resisting change because of shame,
Mm.
my role was to not to induce further shame, I suppose, to talk with them in a genuinely curious way,
Mm.
um, as one human being to another,
Mm.
about the experience,
Mm.
uh, and to ask genuinely interested questions about what would it mean for you if you had done this thing? If
Mm.
you had done this thing, what would be some of the consequences?
Mm.
Um, and we were often talking in the world of the hypothetical, but about very real things.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
Just
and I
that one step removed so they
Yes,
to explore something with some safety and some
yeah.
self-esteem intact, I guess.
Yes, exactly, exactly. And this is very much in line with a relatively modern theory, in criminological research, which is called desistance theory. It's the study of how people give up crime.
Mm.
One of the main researchers in this field, Shad Maruna, whose work is wonderful.
Mm.
He did a lot of work with people who had stopped committed crimes, and he just asked them, "How did you stop?" It's
Mm.
a revolutionary
Yeah.
approach. Um, and what he learned was that many of the people who managed to stop committing crime had comfortable stories
Mm.
to explain away the crimes, which somehow reduced their culpability. You know,
Yeah.
well, of course, I grew up on a street where everybody was doing this. I didn't really have a chance.
Mm.
I was bound to end up doing those things. So it's no wonder really. But I've seen the light now.
Mm.
And now I'm living a different kind of life.
Mm. That's
Um,
really interesting,
and
isn't it? Mm.
yeah, and these kind of stories, were Shabmarina's idea is that the function of that is to preserve a sense of self
Mm.
as a decent person whose future life is worth living, who has a hope of making a meaningful contribution to society.
Mm.
Because without that, why would you change?
Yeah, yeah.
If you were permanently excluded from society, what's the hope for you? How can you be rehabilitated into a society that rejects you as a pariah? Um, and his Shabmarina's initial research wasn't into people who committed sexual offences, but some later researchers have extended that research into this particular group, and it really holds true.
Mm.
It's not talking with people about those stories. It's not the same as colluding. You
No.
never, you would never agree with someone. Like, oh yes, of course, I quite understand. It's more you listen with distance and curiosity,
Mm.
um, without agreeing or reassuring in any way,
Mm.
um, but also without challenging.
Yeah, yeah.
Because what you might be challenging is really that person's sense of themselves as a person
Mm.
who can redeem themselves, who can go on to live a worthwhile life.
Mm. It's really
Um,
important. That is really interesting, isn't it? About
yeah.
helping somebody without colluding with them to sort of
Yes,
build that narrative really that does
yes,
give them an escape route out of
yeah,
shame, and
yes,
that comes across really clearly, but it's kind of quite the opposite, I think, to what we imagine
yes,
therapeutic work with people, particularly who've committed sexual offences,
yes,
who are resistant to
yeah,
admitting, that the impact they've had, quite contrary to what we might imagine that looks like. It's almost like a popular idea might be we try to get people to the point where they do admit it and they can accept it and they
yeah,
can talk about it. But actually,
yeah,
sometimes to change, for that group of
yeah,
people anyway, there's
yeah.
something quite different needed. That's
Yeah.
really interesting.
I think you put your finger on it when you talked about shame. I think that's the case when shame is very high.
Mm.
That I think there is there's a dominant narrative in British society about the need to confess, that
Mm.
the way to redemption is through confessing, make a clean breast of it,
Yeah, yeah,
um,
yeah,
and be absolved,
yeah.
do the time, pay for the crime,
Mm,
admit everything,
mm,
and then you can start again. Then you can be forgiven.
yeah.
Um, and perhaps that's the case for some people. Absolutely, I've certainly worked with people who felt it was very important to take responsibility, to say out loud, "I did these
Mm,
things,"
mm,
to make reparations. I've certainly worked with people for whom that kind of narrative was a good fit.
mm,
Um,
mm,
But I think particularly when levels of shame are so high that a person is facing extreme social rejection,
mm,
it's much less common.
mm.
And actually, we can do the work we need to do to reduce a person's risk of reoffending without them needing to put their hands up and say, "I did this thing."
Yeah, yes,
But
yeah,
that's quite a challenging thought for lots of people. And it was for me when I started out.
yeah,
I remember being very, very kind of new to the work, and really challenging people to accept the harm they'd committed.
yeah, yeah, yeah,
Um, and I think I almost needed to go through that experience to realize how ineffective it was.
yeah,
That actually people clammed up, got
yeah,
more distance. They dug their heels in much more firmly. We ended up butting heads, and I don't think that helped.
yeah, yeah. No, although a very different group with a very different, or a very specific group, I guess it does
Mm,
come back to that point that you made right at the start around change. It's almost like
yes.
if you're trying to change somebody, you're in
Yeah.
you're in this role, aren't you? I am
Yeah.
here to change this person, and I've got to try really hard. And
Yeah.
actually, that often is the very thing that kind of way of viewing your whole role is actually, likely to be the most counterproductive thing you can
Yeah.
do.
Yeah. Exactly.
Mm.
And then with the other group I spoke about of people
Mm.
who aren't really engaging because they want to reoffend,
Yes.
then actually listening to them describe how they view the world, describe their beliefs about relationships, power, sex, consent,
Mm.
their actions, the impact of their actions. It's really important to be able to sit and listen,
Yeah.
because that's how we learn more
Mm.
about the kind of risks that someone might pose.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that's a different set of skills, I think.
Mm. Mm.
And in that case, it's about offering people the opportunity to change.
Yeah.
But once it becomes clear that's not they're not a customer for that,
Yes.
then listening, and in order that we can build as clear a picture as possible of the kind of risks they might pose, under what circumstances and to whom, because then it becomes about external monitoring.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, that
Yeah.
makes sense. So I just want to move us on a little bit to touch
Yeah.
on attachment theory, because you mentioned
Yeah.
if we sort of move through your career in a theoretical sense, the next part of the journey was around your interest in attachment theory, and
Yeah.
I can't pretend I'm not aware to some degree of this, because obviously we wrote a book, didn't we, on
We did. Yeah.
strength-based practice and attachment theory,
Yeah.
and how we might use both of those approaches together in our work with older people. But for people who are watching this who perhaps don't know very much or don't know anything at all about attachment theory, are you able to just kind of, I know it's a complicated area and you could deliver a whole 2-day training session, but you are able to give us a kind of a
Yeah.
summary, a kind of overview of what that means, and then we'll just
Yeah, of
dig a
course, of
little.
course. Let me know if I get too boring, because
I'm sure you won't.
I can waffle for Britain on this. Um, so I guess my understanding of what attachment theory is, it, it's it's a theory or a set of knowledge about a behavioral system that all mammals possess.
Mm,
It's a behavioral system that is activated by perceiving threat or danger.
mm,
And when we perceive threat or danger, all mammals will approach a person, a being, another, a being of the same species, who is stronger and wiser, and capable of protecting them and offering comfort.
mhm,
So we can think about this in, it's most usually understood in terms of infancy. And you can think about a toddler who's off playing in their living room, off exploring their toys, knowing that their mum or dad or carer is in the next room, and they feel perfectly content. They kind of know in their mind that there's a big person there if they need them, but they because they feel calm, they don't need them right now. And then maybe something happens, maybe a big dog goes past in the garden and barks, or maybe they fall over. And at that point, the attachment system kicks in,
Mm.
and the infant or toddler has the experience of feeling overwhelmed, having needs that they cannot manage for themselves, and needing to approach a stronger, wiser, bigger one of the same species, for comfort and protection and safety. Um, and so we often think about proximity, so how the infant would approach the carer to get physically close.
Mhm.
We think about safety and comfort, and we can also think about familiarity as one of the key needs that underpins the attachment system. Having a sense of, if I approach my attachment figure with this kind of need, this is how they're likely to respond.
Mm.
So it's about familiarity and predictability.
Yeah, yeah.
I'm a particular student of a model called the Dynamic Maturational Model of Attachment and Adaptation by Patricia Crittenden,
Mhm.
which is a very contemporary model of attachment, which has a lot of very interesting things to say about change.
Yes. And tell me more because I mean, I was just in a conversation with somebody only the other day, actually, and I mentioned attachment theory, and the response was a little bit around, oh, we tend not to kind of use that because we don't want
Yeah,
it to seem that we're kind of either blaming, in this
yeah.
instance, it was mothers, it was a service working with women,
Mm, mm.
um, and I know another kind of concern about attachment, you've mentioned obviously a lot of these, the way in which we build our attachments often happens in infancy. So there's a kind of sense, if we're not careful, are we a bit locked into the patterns that we had,
Oh, absolutely.
when we,
Absolutely.
in those very early years. So I'm really interested in, what
Yeah.
Crittenden and your way of seeing the world, has to say about change, really, and what's possible and how we can change.
Yeah, it's so interesting. I think attachment theory is often taught in a very rushed, superficial way,
Mm.
and people get the impression that it's all about mothers, it's all a bit middle class and twee,
Mhm.
and it says that each one of us is put into one of four boxes by the end of our childhood, and in that box we shall stay until the end of time.
Mm.
Um, and those boxes are kind of secure attachment, a couple of different types of insecure attachment, and then often disorganized attachment. Um, a- and those ideas are really out of date and really flawed.
Mm.
When you read Bowlby, the kind of the idea about gender,
Mm.
and feminism is a really interesting one. There's a lot going on there, I think. When you read Bowlby's writings, he writes a lot more about the animal kingdom than he does about the human kingdom.
Mm.
Um, there are a couple of phrases that often stay in people's minds, things like mother love is as vital for infant development as vitamins. I think it might be a slight misquote, but he talks about mother love.
Mm.
I think he was, being generous towards Bowlby, having read a lot of his work. I think he's a product of his time. He was
Yeah,
writing in the
say,
50s.
yeah,
It was post-war.
yeah,
There was a real drive to get men back to work,
yeah, yeah.
um, and to kind of have a booming population.
Absolutely.
Um,
Mothers were the primary carers in
yeah,
most scenarios, weren't they, back
yeah,
then? And obviously we're living
quite,
in a completely
quite.
different world now, aren't we? Where
Yeah,
I think much more gender balance around parenting. Yeah.
absolutely. And I think contemporary attachment theory is very mindful of human diversity, be that based on race, culture, class, living environment, type of community, gender, sexual identity.
Mm.
Yeah, so I'm not sure that's a criticism that can be leveled at contemporary attachment theory research. It can certainly be leveled at the ways in which attachment theory has been used.
Okay.
But I think they're two different things. Uh,
Yeah, yeah.
I think there have been campaigns to, keep mothers in the home and let's not use nurseries
Mm.
because nurseries damage children's attachment. And those can be really oppressive messages, oppressive for men and women,
Yeah,
saying
yeah,
that men can't be primary carers and women must be.
yeah, yeah.
These are complicated messages. So I think there's definitely some criticisms that could be made of how attachment theory has been used.
Yeah.
But contemporary attachment research is very mindful of the diversity of the range of human experience.
Yeah, yeah. No, that's really
Um,
helpful. And so, I mean, I guess we can all kind of see elements of the way in which our attachment systems veer into, as you mentioned
yeah,
earlier, some of those different boxes, different types, different,
yeah,
whatever. We've all had a range of experiences. Obviously, some people who've really experienced extreme trauma or grown up in, war-torn environments,
yeah.
going to have particular kinds of relationships to risk and threat and so on and so forth. But how can people change some of those things? How can we kind of unpick some of that when it's become, you know, perhaps not through anyone's fault, but has become quite literally hardwired within us really to respond, in a particular way to risk and threat. How can we kind of break free from that? What does that look like?
Oh, well, a slightly flippant answer is that we need to do it very, very slowly. It
Mm,
takes a lot, it takes a lot of commitment, a lot of effort, a
mm,
lot of repetition, and
mm.
it's not quick.
Mm,
But it's certainly possible. Um,
mm,
so the dynamic matchmational model would hold that infants and children develop attachment strategies which get the best out of their parents or carers.
okay.
So without turning this into a lecture on attachment theory, the ways in which the infant experiences the kind of care that they are offered.
Mm,
The two aspects are really important. One is predictability. So
mm,
how consistent is the parent's response? Do they do the same thing on a Monday as they do on a Wednesday, for example? And the other is attunement. How emotionally sensitive,
mm,
and how contingent, how connected to what the child is doing is
mm,
the parent's response.
mm,
And those qualities of predictability and attunement lead the child to develop the attachment strategy that gets the best out of the parent or carer, and promotes their survival.
mm,
About broadly speaking, around 60% of children in safe contexts develop what's called a secure attachment strategy, and about 40% develop what's called an insecure attachment strategy. And of insecure strategies, there are broadly speaking, two different types.
mhm,
One that emphasizes the learning to follow rules, learning to dismiss your emotions, of sometimes called anxious avoidant attachment, or type A,
mhm,
and the other being focused on hyper expressing your emotions and trying to keep the caregiver close. That would be, broadly speaking, anxious ambivalent or type C attachment.
mm,
Um, and one of the things that I most respect about the dynamic maturational model of attachment and adaptation is its focus on adaptation.
mm,
I rather ponderously repeated the title of it.
mm,
That human beings adapt to the environment around them, including the relational environment, so the caregiving environment around them. So it stands to reason that if the environment changes, the person's attachment strategies can change.
right.
It's
Yeah.
very common for children or young people who grow up in more than one household to have more than one strategy,
Mm,
because they
mm.
need to learn to fit in with more than one relational environment.
Yeah.
Um,
That. Yeah.
yeah,
Mm,
and that we need to be very careful not to describe insecure attachment as somehow a deficit.
right.
Secure attachment is brilliant, but only if you grow up in conditions of safety and comfort.
Yeah.
If you don't, boy, do you need your insecure attachment strategy
Mm,
to help you survive and thrive and stay safe. in an environment where protection and comfort aren't always available.
Mm.
Um, Pat Crittenden puts a lot of focus on attachment into adulthood.
Mm.
So she has this idea about, she calls it the earned be. So this is about a way in which we can develop a secure attachment strategy across our lifespan through earning it.
I see.
So, yeah. So
Earned
we're
B, as in BE or BE.
good question. No, B is the secure strategy.
I see.
It's like an
Like an
earned,
B.
yeah, it's good to clarify that. It's like
Yeah,
an earned secure attachment
I
that
see.
somebody who started off life with insecure strategies might, across the course of their lifespan,
I
learn to move closer to a secure attachment strategy.
see. That makes sense. Yep, yep, yep.
And I think this is where I've done a lot of thinking about what this change looks like.
Mm,
um, that for many people, it's the work of a lifetime. It doesn't happen overnight.
mm,
It often starts with noticing patterns. You know,
mm,
why do I keep having relationships with people like this? Why
mm,
do I end up having these same conflicts with different people in my life? Why is it that I often feel these particular feelings around relation? Why am I drawn to people who make me feel that way?
mm,
And it can start as just the germ of a thought,
mm.
and it might take many years to build up into a sense of, okay, this is something I need to do something about.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And for me, that's and some people never do. And
Mm,
for me, that's the important thing about change.
mm,
Whenever I've spoken to someone who has been through this process or read an adult attachment interview, that's the tool that's used to assess adult attachment. Most people can name something that set them off on this journey.
mm.
You know, like, well, I had a row with my ex partner, and I realized, sorry, there's a siren. I don't know if you can hear.
No, 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 no.
Um, so you know, I had a row with my partner, and I looked up at them and I realized that they were looming over me just like my dad used to do.
Yes, a real.
And woof, I thought, hang on a minute, you
Mm,
know, I can't unsee this now that I've seen it. I need to do something different. So that would just be one example. Most people can point to a time that they noticed something that was uncomfortable, like the grit in the oyster, I
mm,
suppose.
mm,
Um, and then and then and then people have choices to make,
mm,
um, about, do I pursue this? Do I put it back in its box?
mm, mm,
Um, Clearly, not everyone has equal opportunity to do that. You know, you mentioned living in a war zone. If you're living in a war zone, obviously, just getting enough food, staying safe,
mm,
finding medical care, hiding from, you know, aggressors. Those are going to be the things that are top of your list.
mm,
Um, and some communities will have greater access to the conditions that would support them
mm,
to undertake such a reflective process than others.
mm,
Um, but it for some people it can look like therapy.
yeah,
For other people, it might look like a loving relationship.
yeah.
Um, Others, it might look like a love of nature, you
Mm,
know, setting yourself a challenge of, you know, walking a pilgrimage, that kind of thing. Or for others, it might be a spiritual belief or a religious belief.
mm,
For others, it might be something physical, you know, training in Tai Chi or martial arts
mm,
or dance, expressive dance.
mm,
There's no one way,
mm,
at all, but what they tend to have in common is that it's very deliberate,
mm,
and it's about doing something different
mm,
in order to notice the change that happens within yourself and how you understand your emotions, what you do with your emotions, how you behave in relationships, how
mm,
you make sense of others. So it's very deliberate,
mm.
um, and it's a process that cannot be hurried.
Yeah.
And as I said, for many people, it's an ongoing work of a lifetime.
Mm,
Uh,
yeah,
so,
absolutely.
and that's really influenced my understanding about
Yeah,
change,
yeah,
these really fundamental changes. How do I change my sense of who I am, who I want to be, how I make sense of my narrative
yeah,
and my story, my relationships?
absolutely. And presumably just that kind of step of noticing. you know,
Yeah.
just that step of being aware of some of those patterns and recognizing that there are elements in that that, can get in the way of other relationships or
Yeah.
of other parts of our lives is in itself an important thing. I mean, even if we can't immediately get rid of some of those, very sort of ingrained behaviors and emotional responses, I suppose at least if we're aware of them and we recognize them when they happen, that's sort of part of the battle, isn't it, I guess?
Yeah, absolutely. And you can't unsee it.
No.
Once you've had that reflective thought, that moment of awareness,
Yeah.
it's not possible to take it back.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then that can sit around, building momentum, I suppose,
Yeah.
for some people for many, many years,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
until they find themselves in a position where they want to revisit it or are able to revisit it.
Yeah. Yeah. The scales literally drop from your eyes, and you have that kind of moment of realization.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's really interesting.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, and obviously you've gravitated, as you said at the start, towards becoming a systemic
Mm.
practitioner, and you described briefly to us what
Indeed.
that meant in terms of both families, but also other kinds of systems that you might work within
Yes.
teams, groups. But I guess,
Yeah.
at that kind of individual, direct, therapeutic level, your work has become much more situated within families, I guess, over
Yeah.
time. And I'm just wondering, what attracted you to that first of all? What kind of made you? You'd obviously spent a lot of time thinking about attachment theory, and then you kind of took it to this next stage. What do you why what did you think that kind of held in this journey of this journey towards better understanding of change?
Yeah. What a great question, Imogen. Um, I mean, I can answer that on a number of different levels.
Mm,
A very pragmatic answer is that I did an MSc in attachment theory,
mm,
which was wonderful. And one of the modules was about applications of attachment theory in therapeutic settings. And a systemic psychotherapist called Dr. Chip Chimera came and offered a few lectures about family therapy, linking it with attachment theory. And I was just blown away. It it felt a little bit like coming home. I think because I'd spent so many years of my early career working in groups,
mm,
and then and getting really nosy with people about their narratives and their stories and how they made sense of themselves and their behaviors and their choices. And then to hear that you could combine that with an understanding of attachment in relationships, I was like, wow, this is the thing that will finally make my crazy career make sense.
mm, mm.
So on a very pragmatic level, that's how I first became aware of it.
Yeah.
Um, and I think why I pursued it, it was a very intense 4 year training, which you have to pay for. I had to pay for myself and had to do it alongside working to pay for it.
Mm,
It was probably the most demanding qualification I've ever done.
mm,
Um, and I think what kept me going were seeing moments of change
mm,
in families.
mm,
Um, and one of the things I'm really passionate about with systemic family therapy is how much thought we give to the use of power,
mm,
and working in anti-oppressive ways,
mm,
thinking about the different dimensions of identity and self, which either give us access to power or make that or take power away from us.
mm,
Um, and that level of sensitivity and flexibility about how we connect with families is something that I found really appealing.
mm,
Um, and I think when I think I'm practicing family therapy at its best, it's often when I'm working with, for example, a parent and a child. The child could be any age, even an adult child, and supporting them to have conversations about their experience of similar events within the family that they wouldn't be able to have without me there,
mm,
perhaps because they would perhaps because it would feel too unsafe,
mm.
or perhaps because they would fall back into the patterns they've always had,
Yeah. Yeah.
of one person leaving the room, or them shouting at each other. Um, and I think in that, I view my role there as I don't know. It's kind of like I I support I support the family to create the conditions for these conversations
Yeah.
by 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 helping them to name some of the things that get in the way,
Yeah.
helping them to name and recognize the influence of trauma, the influence of violence, the influence of poverty,
Mm.
um, and the influence that those things may have had on the conversations they've been able to have so far.
Mm.
And then supporting them to take risks, I think change involves risk.
Mm.
I think I believe that all change involves taking risks because it involves giving up something that's familiar,
Yeah.
even
Yeah.
if it's not working
Yeah.
for you, it's familiar.
Yeah. Better the devil we
Um,
know, you know.
yeah,
Yeah,
quite.
absolutely.
So I think that's one of the skill sets I have as a family therapist is sitting with families
Mm.
and offering or trying to offer a sense of safety and warmth,
Mm.
non-judgment,
Mm.
connection,
Yeah.
in a very intentional way.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
then helping people to listen to each other and ask questions they haven't been able to ask before.
Mm. Mm.
Um,
And those questions, I imagine, provide just enough structure around it to kind of, there's that kind of balance between acting as a guide but not
yeah,
being completely directional, isn't there?
yeah,
The family needs to explore what it needs to explore, but actually without you
yeah,
creating some kind of key
yeah,
milestones within that, opening up new doors or just kind of bringing the whole thing safely to a conclusion at
yeah,
the end of a session. It could,
yeah,
they may just not take it in the direction that perhaps it needs to go at some level for
yeah.
all sorts of reasons.
Yeah, I agree. It's a very interventive kind of therapy.
Mm.
It's absolutely not the kind of therapy where I would say to a family, "So, what shall we talk about today?
Mm.
You know, who's going to begin?"
Mm.
Um, because often what we would see is just acting out the things that have been painful.
Yeah.
That can be useful.
Mm.
It can help me to better understand some of the patterns and dynamics and challenges.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, but just reenacting what's already happening isn't going to lead to change.
Yeah, and the most powerful members of the family will presumably just control the whole discussion,
Yeah,
and things
yeah,
will either the difficult topics will never be broached, or they'll
yeah,
be broached, but in a massively uncontrolled,
yeah.
emotional way, I'm guessing. So,
Yes, because that therapy's never neutral. It can make things worse.
mm,
I have a very strong ethical belief that my first duty is not to make things worse.
yeah, 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 yeah,
And that could be as simple as someone leaving, going, "That's it, I'm never, ever, ever doing therapy again." You
mm,
know, to my mind, that would be making things worse.
yeah, yeah,
Or repeating it, allowing oppressive experiences to be repeated, or listening to if I heard very critical, hurtful words about somebody in the family and didn't just pause
mm,
and think about that together,
mm, mm,
then they might see me as condoning that or backing it up.
yeah,
Um,
yeah, yeah,
so I'm very, very careful and intentional
mm,
uh,
mm.
with my aim of not making things worse,
Yeah,
which
and
sounds like a low bar, I
no,
admit.
no, but and I guess it comes back to that point you made at the start around, leaving the door open. You may not get as far as you'd like to with a family at this particular moment in time, but actually, at least if their experience of being in a therapeutic setting is a
Yes,
positive one, then it may well be something that they
yeah,
feel they come back to at a later stage, but actually,
very much.
that and that's really important, isn't it?
Yeah,
Because that's the other thing about change is we know it doesn't happen overnight, does it?
no,
It's often a cyclical process with,
yeah,
many highs and lows and backs and
yeah,
forths. And yeah, so
yeah.
that makes a lot of sense.
I think I learned that when I was working with long-term prisoners. I would very often see them once a year, so I
Oh,
would go and visit them in prison once a year. And there might be kind of calls or letters in between, but a face-to-face visit would happen once a year. And a number of times I would sit with people on these kind of visits in these weird legal visits rooms, and I would be talking to them about the kind of things that had got them into prison and how did they view them now, what did they want support with. Um, And very often we'd have a conversation where I'd maybe plant a seed, there is this course that you could do, or, have you thought about what it might mean for you if you go back and live on that same estate,
Mm,
when you're released?
mm,
And very often people would kind of shrug at me
mm,
and not really seem to engage with the question I was asking, or the gentle suggestion I was making, the little nudge, I suppose.
mm,
Um, and I'd go away thinking of, well, that was a waste of time. I might as well just have talked to myself for an hour.
mm,
But then on a number of really memorable occasions, I would go back the next year
mm.
and the person would say to me, you know what? I've been thinking about that thing you said, and dot dot dot. And that really, I can't think of many environments where it would be as stark as that.
Yeah.
And it really taught me a valuable lesson that
Mm.
that the change doesn't the change rarely happens in the session.
Yeah.
My role isn't to make the person change, it's to ask the questions, take the risks, hold hope for them,
Mm.
um, offer ideas, and then leave it with them, get out of their way and leave it with them.
Very
Um,
interesting. Yeah.
yeah. And even if they didn't look like they were even listening,
Yeah. And
knows what the impact, we never know. It's that whole butterfly wing theory, isn't it, that we never know the impact, the true impact of our words and actions.
that's particularly interesting. I was sort of thinking as you're talking about, what all of this means for people that are designing and delivering services. And we've got into this whole we're obsessed with, doing things really quickly, aren't we? It's how can we have a brief
Yeah,
intervention? You can have
yeah,
6 sessions, 3 sessions, maybe 12, maybe 16. It's all going to happen in a month. We've got to close it in case people become dependent on us. That's become very
yeah,
much the kind of style of commissioning.
definitely.
Your model of going to visit somebody once a year
Once a year.
over perhaps 15 years. Very different way of a very different worldview
Mm,
around how we can support people to
yeah,
change. I don't know.
it's so true. So
Yeah.
true. And I guess I have nothing against brief interventions, but I think a lot of the work happens before the person gets through the door for the
Mm,
first session.
that's interesting.
You
Yeah.
know, it will depend, the success of that will depend on what a person's readiness to change and their belief in their capacity to change. And that will happen even before they walk through the door.
Yeah, yeah, depending on the reasons that brought them through. I mean, we
Yeah,
we talked about people who sort of
yeah,
statutorily don't really have a choice, but actually, if people have come, having been through that kind of journey we were talking about in terms of noticing some of their
yeah,
own patterns and
mm,
reaching the stage where they want to have some therapy around that, then, they've already done a lot of that homework, haven't
yeah,
they, before they come to you.
yeah, yeah,
Mm,
yeah,
mm, yeah.
exactly.
And so I guess just to sort of wrap up, really, I mean, it's been really interesting thinking about the relationship between individual change and thinking about how people do or don't change within particularly family units.
Yeah,
And to think about, I mean, one of the things I've been really struck by as you've talked is how, although you obviously have, done all this incredibly in-depth studying and the theoretical knowledge is immense, but in some ways, the kind of messages around, certainly the pitfalls of how we might not go about trying to change people, there's a kind of a very sort of purposeful holding back, isn't there, in
yeah,
all these
yeah.
roles, and that's really struck me. So I'm wondering, what do all of those two different sort of themes that we've been thinking about, what does that kind of, what can we draw from that for service design, for what we need to think about in our systems? What should we avoid as pitfalls there, perhaps?
What an interesting question. And one that isn't really my skill set massively. This is one of the reasons I so enjoy talking with you, Imogen, because we've often approached quite similar
Mm,
challenges or needs,
mm,
unmet needs, from
mm,
quite different angles.
mm.
And you're really brilliant at thinking about service design and evaluation in a way that I'm much more amateur at. But uh, I think we need to be really clear about what counts as evidence.
Yeah.
I very often hear the phrase evidence-based practice, or
Mhm.
is this in line with the evidence base?
Mm.
And half the time I wonder to myself, if I asked the person to define evidence-based practice or summarize the evidence base, I wonder what they'd say.
Yeah, not
Um,
much probably. At best, they might be able to do a quick Google search and refer you back to some RCT that was done in,
yeah,
randomized control trial done in America in the 90s, but probably not really
yeah,
relating to what they're actually doing now here. Yeah.
right, right. So,
Mm,
so yeah, I have thoughts about
mm,
the an appeal to the evidence base and
mm,
who that serves.
mm.
Which are probably for another time.
Yeah.
Um, uh, and so that would be one change that I would make, a broadening out of what we understand by evidence,
Yes. Yeah.
and a broadening out of the kinds of evidence that counts and the kind that doesn't hold weight or isn't seen to hold weight in our current system.
Yeah.
I'd
Yeah.
spend a lot more time talking to people who use our services
Yes.
about what they found helpful.
Yeah.
Um,
Absolutely.
in more in-depth ways.
Yeah.
Um,
And your example of earlier, I forgot the name of the researcher, but
Chad Maruna.
yeah, who
Yeah.
just went and asked the people for whom
Yes.
it
Yeah.
worked and said, what did that look like? What were we able to do, or what did we not do? How did that
What
kind
did you do?
of
Yeah.
how
Yeah. Yeah.
how did that go for you?
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
And I think I would. I think I've learnt that it's helpful to really start by asking people what their goals are for a
Mm,
particular course of therapy or a particular piece of work or offer of support,
mm,
and not assume that my goals are the same as their goals.
mm,
um, and to be very explicit about that. It's okay if we have different goals.
mm,
That doesn't mean we can't work together,
mm.
but it's going to get in the way if we're not open about that.
Yeah, yeah, that's really important. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
definitely. Yes, and
But
sometimes in those statutory roles, you can't help but have a different role.
yeah,
and somebody may not agree with that. But yes, if you don't talk about it, it's not
yes,
going to work, is it?
exactly. And it can feel risky to talk about that. There can be an assumption, well, you've turned up here in this NHS building, so this must be what you want. You
Mm,
must see things the way I see them, or the way that the medical hierarchy sees them, because you've turned up asking for a service.
mm,
And actually, if you really slow things down and ask the child, what do you want? The parent, what do you want? The school, what's the change you want to see?
mm,
The psychiatrist,
mm.
what's the change you think you can support? You might get very different answers.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, and the child might say, I just want someone to talk to,
Mm, mm,
um, who doesn't judge me. The
mm,
parent might say, I just want them to start listening to me and doing what I tell them to do.
mm.
I want them to start going to school.
Yeah.
The school might say, I want them to stop being aggressive in class when they're asked to sit down.
Mm,
And the psychiatrist might be thinking in terms of what diagnosis to make.
mm, mm,
And we can all, that they might all be valid perspectives. We can come together and have a conversation,
mm,
but we need to acknowledge our different points of view and our different beliefs about change
mm,
and about what's possible.
yeah,
And I think that's something I've really learnt,
yeah,
um,
yeah,
working as a systemic psychotherapist,
yeah.
is that it's okay to have different points of view. Professionals will have different points of view from each other. That's okay. We can, as long as we hold those,
Yeah,
um, without needing everybody to agree,
yeah.
as long as we're open about it.
It's really important and interesting for both working with families, but also working in multidisciplinary teams.
Yes,
Yeah,
yes,
really how we kind of organize that and how we talk about change and
yes,
clear about what our objectives are and where they do and don't overlap from different
yeah,
professional backgrounds.
yes.
Wow, we could open up another whole thing, but we better not because listeners will be busy people, I'm sure.
Indeed.
But it's been an absolute pleasure to talk to you, Lydia. Thank you
Mm,
so much for all of those reflections. Really, really
mm.
interesting. Thank you.
Thank you, Imogen. Thank you for inviting me. It's been a real pleasure to have a different kind of conversation
Yeah,
together. Thank you.
absolutely.
Really enjoyed it.
Thank you.